It's actually not the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is what tells us the purpose of government. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's in the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. When a government becomes destructive to these ends, it becomes the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, setting its foundation on such principles as to them would seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's the purpose of government in America, is that it would protect life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Feds, where we seek to expose and hold accountable those who have pursued unconstitutional and unethical behaviors within the United States government. I am Stephanie Weidel. Please go ahead and follow us on our social medias. Check out our Substack. Please like, comment, and share our podcast. Please share our podcast. We are dealing with a lot of censorship right now. We have a very generous donor who has offered us a $10,000 matching donation through the end of November. Please help us take advantage of this and make an early end-of-the-year donation so we can continue moving the needle towards accountability through lawsuits and this podcast. You can find all donation links at Feds for Freedom's website, fedsforfreedom.org.
Welcome to The Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dan Abbott, a National Guardsman. He was ranked the number 3 non-commissioned officer for all of the National Guard in 2023. He is the commander of the Campbell County Militia in Virginia. And an article has come out since September labeling his militia as extremist. Since then, a National Guard investigation has been opened against him. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today. It is a pleasure to meet you.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Could you give us a little bit of your history, ending with why you joined the National Guard?
Sure. So I was born and raised in upstate New York, and ever since the time that I was, a very small child, I had a very, very keen interest in anything military. And actually, I was homeschooled, and so my mom's method of getting me interested in history is that we just studied American history by studying through the wars, because there hasn't ever really been a time in American history where we've gone more than, like 20 or 30 years without a war. And of course, that kept my interest very keenly. And so I enlisted in the Army when I was 26, and prior to enlisting, I was heavily involved with firefighting and EMS, search and rescue, all that kind of thing. And I looked at the Army as the military as a way to supplement or build off of that search and rescue and that firefighting, that community service. And actually, what I originally looked at was Coast Guard. I wanted to really lean on the search and rescue side of it, and unfortunately, they were on a hiring freeze. And so I looked at other stuff, trying to find something that was similar or close to that. And what I finally rested on was the it's an 18X is what it's called, and it's where Special Forces recruits off the street and basically gives people a shot at going to selection. And so that perked my interest. I was interested in the medic program with Special Forces. And so that's how I got into the Army. Eventually, I washed out near the end of the Q course and went to the 82nd Airborne Division. I spent 5 years on active duty, and when I left active duty, I had a first sergeant that really leaned on me. I had some complaints and some gripes about the military and the way things worked and whatever. And his comment to me was, well, if your gripes and your complaints are legitimate and you actually want to change things, well, you have to stay and change them. You can't complain about the condition of the military or complain about the condition of your country for that matter, and then just run away from it, because it's never going to get better. And that really hit me hit me pretty hard. And so when I left active duty, I came to the Virginia Army National Guard through what they call a Trial 1 program. And I've been in the National Guard for 6 years now, a little over 6 years. So yeah, that's what brought me to the National Guard. Is I wanted to be able to continue to serve and to change the military in my country for the better and improve it.
So you are also the commander of the Campbell County Militia in Lynchburg, Virginia. So how did that come about?
So if we think back to beginning of 2020, you had a new majority took over, a liberal majority took over in the Virginia legislature, and their stated goal was to pass a bunch of sweeping gun control legislation. And in response to that, VCDL capitalized on what's called Lobby Day, which is it's actually a really cool program that Virginia legislature does every year, which is they schedule a day that is the opportunity for we the people to petition our government for a redress of grievances. That's our opportunity to come and interact with the legislature and approach them directly with our concerns. And so VCDL said, hey, the legislature has given us this opportunity. We're going to take advantage of it, and we're all going to show up at the Capitol and petition for a redress of grievances. So estimates are all over the place, but on the low end, 50,000. On the high end, closer to 100,000 people showed up to the Virginia Capitol in Richmond to petition their government to not restrict their Second Amendment rights. And the kind of second and third order effects of that were that localities, cities and counties, as well as sheriffs, started saying, well, we're going to declare ourselves a 2A sanctuary. We're not going to let government come in and strip our people of their individual liberty. And in response to that, one of the legislators who was out of Newport News said, well, that's not how this works. You can't defy the state. We'll nationalize the National Guard, and we'll come and enforce the law. And the people's response to that is, well, now wait a minute. Like these are our elected officials. This is our sheriff, our board of supervisors. These are our people that we know and trust. We're not going to just let you come in here and remove and incarcerate people. Really the only way to respond to force of arms is to respond with force of arms. And so Bedford County was the first one to have a public militia muster. As far as I can tell, they're the first locality to have one since before the Civil War. Early 1860s is the last place that I can find documentation of actual public musters. And so Bedford did it, and then about 2 weeks later, Campbell County did the same thing. And we ended up with, like 250 some odd people that signed up to become members. And maybe a month later, the Campbell County Board of Supervisors actually passed a resolution and formally recognized Campbell County Militia as a county asset, as sort of a partner in government with them, which was phenomenal.
They actually recognized it as a defense against a tyrannical government.
Correct.
The county said this.
Correct.
Good for them.
All the county is doing is they're looking at the Second Amendment, and they're looking at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the U.S. Constitution, and they're looking at the Federalist Papers and going, well, it's abundantly clear what was intended by well-regulated militia. Madison says it repeatedly in different ways. Hamilton says it repeatedly in different ways. Patrick Henry says it. George Washington says it. I mean, it's a verifiable fact that was the intent, the purpose of well-regulated militia, is that we, the people of the United States of America, would maintain that monopoly on force.
Absolutely. All right. So how did you become the commander, and what became of the militia after that?
Well, so on the muster cards, which were basically a way for the organizers to get back in touch with people, there was a little box that you could check if you were interested in leadership. And I was pretty curious. I was like, you know what, this was pretty well put together, and we've got board members here, and there's members of the Virginia House of Delegates here, and there's law enforcement officers here, and this is pretty squared away. And I said, you know what, I'm very interested, and I want to see how this develops. So I checked the box, interested in leadership, and we ended up with 20, 25 people, something like that, sitting around a conference table in a public library, and the beginning of that conversation, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks later, maybe a week later, something like that. The beginning of the conversation was, we've all made a horrible mistake. We are on every list that there is to be on. We're probably all going to jail. This was a really, really bad idea. Maybe if we just burn these muster cards and we all go home, pretend like this never happened, they'll just forget and it won't be a problem. But then we looked at the Second Amendment. And what I would argue are some of the finest men in the history of the world penned that well-regulated militia was necessary to the security of a free state. And we went, now wait a minute. That's the only place in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights that the word necessary appears. That's an awful lot of emphasis that's placed on the existence of well-regulated militia. Maybe we should take a long, hard look at this before we throw in the towel and act like cowards. And so we started going, okay, when I say militia today, that's like the dirty M word. It's like a 4-letter word. I don't know how you spell it and only get 4 letters, but it's done. And we said, well, is that what men like Madison and Hamilton and Washington, is that what they meant when they said that this was necessary? And we went, well, certainly not. What did they mean when they said this was necessary? So we started looking at it in historical context. What did this word mean? What did these organizations look like in the 1770s? And we basically identified 3 characteristics that we believed made well-regulated militia necessary to the security of a free state. One of those we pulled right out of Virginia Code Section 44-1, the second half of the Second Amendment, and U.S. Title 10, which is the 1903 National Defense Authorization Act. 44-1 defines militia in the state of Virginia as having 3 components. One is the Virginia Army National Guard, one is the Virginia Defense Force, and the third is the unorganized militia, which it further defines as being the whole body of the people, males ages 16 to 55. It's basically military-aged or able-bodied men are part of the unorganized militia. U.S. Title 10 says basically the exact same thing. I think it changes the parameters to 18 to 45 instead of 16 to 55, and it includes females that have volunteered for the National Guard or whatever. And then, of course, the second half of the Second Amendment captures and ties that whole idea together when it says that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so we said, okay, this is a very, very important characteristic, is that these organizations are made up of the whole body of the people. It's all of the military-aged males or all of the able-bodied men in the community are invested in this. The second characteristic that we identified was that every community had a well-regulated militia. And it was like, well, why? Why does every community have one? And so we started digging into how these organizations operated and functioned and what they actually did. And what we discovered is that there's a whole bunch of stuff or organizations that are present today that were not present in the 1770s. For one, we have a huge standing army. 2, we have monstrous law enforcement departments, basically at every level, state, federal, local. We have a huge amount of law enforcement. We also have fire departments. You can't find anywhere in America that's not covered by the jurisdiction of some fire department. Same thing with EMS. Emergency medical coverage is everywhere. Search and rescue teams. What about highway departments and departments of transportation? They're huge, and in every community, every road, there is someone who's responsible for the maintenance of that road and those bridges. But they didn't have any of that in the 1770s. And so what happened in the 1770s when a building in town caught on fire? What did they do? Well, they called all of the able-bodied men. They called the militia. And, if North Carolina right now, Tennessee, parts of Virginia, perfect example. What happens when a flood comes through and it washes out roads and bridges and stuff like that, destroys infrastructure? Well, who repairs all of that? Well, it's all the men of the community. They called out the militia, and the militia would deal with it. And of course, there's actually there is a later, I guess, version or rendition, whatever you want to call it, of militia, which we usually associate it with the Wild West. So you still had a sheriff that was responsible for a locality. But what did a sheriff do when he needed additional manpower for really anything? He would deputize citizens and form a posse made up of the able-bodied men of the community to assist local law enforcement. And militia was the same thing in the 1770s. That was the organization that the sheriff would reach out to if he needed additional manpower for whatever, because it's made up of all the men in the community. And the third characteristic that we identified was the quality of the character of the men that led those organizations and steered those ships, which of course is Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams and Sam Adams and Madison and Hamilton, and the list just goes on and on and on. And if you do a deep dive, the quality of the character of these men was just absolutely remarkable. When those men got together and stated that they would, with a firm reliance on the protections of the divine providence, that they would mutually pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to each other. Those men meant that. They meant it from the bottom of their heart. These are unbelievably fine men. Those were the men that led those organizations and steered those ships. And, they were mayors of towns, they were pastors of churches, they were businessmen, merchants, lawyers, military veterans. They were the finest men in the communities, and it needs to be exactly the same thing today. The men that lead constitutional, well-regulated militia in our communities should be the finest men in our communities. They should be the pastors of our churches and the mayors of our town. They should sit on our boards of supervisors. They should be military officers or non-commissioned officers. They should be local elected officials, the coach of the Little League team, the chief of the volunteer fire department. They're the exact same men today that they were then. They're those men that are already identified as leaders in our communities. We just need to overcome 100 years of indoctrination and help those men to understand that they have an additional responsibility beyond what they're already doing to maintain well-regulated militia in their communities.
Yes. Now, when did citizen-led militia start to dissipate in history?
So, yeah, that's actually a great question. So prior to the American Revolution, and immediately afterwards, really up through the War of 1812, and actually most of those laws are still on the books. Militia service was actually mandatory. It was a requirement. And actually, that's what Virginia Code Section 44-1 is. That's actually it's kind of like a draft parameter. In the event that the governor activated the unorganized militia across the state of Virginia, if you're a male ages 16 to 55, you're required to report. And then the National Guard will sift through and they'll figure out how much manpower they need and what skill sets and whatever. They'll do their thing. But there were laws all across all of the colonies had them that actually required compulsory militia service. And if you didn't serve, if you weren't able-bodied or whatever, you actually had to pay a fine. And the fine was, you had a choice. You could choose to serve, but if you didn't serve, you were required to pay the fine. It was basically, you're either going to give of your time or you're going to give of your money. You choose which. And those laws were actually very stringently enforced leading up to the American Revolution, through the Revolution, and in that time afterwards, before the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, they really just kind of stopped enforcing those laws. They didn't disappear, but the enforcement of them became sporadic at best.
And so after that, people just stopped forming militia. And if they were interested in being in a military kind of group, they would just join the bigger military at that point. Well,
actually, not necessarily. The standing U.S. military was still very, very small. I could be wrong, but I believe at the start of the Civil War, the standing army was only 16,000 personnel.
Wow.
The War of 1812 was fought relying entirely on militia. And the reality is the Civil War was fought relying entirely on militia. And actually, that was the Civil War, the aftermath of the Civil War, was really the death of militia, because all of the states that had seceded were stripped of their right to form militia. That was one of the conditions of re-entering the Union after the war, is that they no longer had the right to maintain well-regulated militia. And it's actually interesting. That was one of the things that was being offered to slaves, is that if they fought, they would gain the right to be in a militia. They would gain the right to possess force of arms, which was something that was obviously very, very important. So yeah, the Civil War, or the aftermath of the Civil War, was really kind of the death of well-regulated militia.
Before I get into what the purpose of the militia is at now in today's society, what you see the purpose is, I do want to mention we're going to have an episode with Terrence Popp, who has combated veteran suicide through comedy videos. And he says that men have not just an awkward place in society, they have no place in society. And so the thought of militia actually gives them a place in society.
Yes, that's 150% true. From a psychological standpoint, men need to have a purpose. Men, in order to, so we have this depression, I guess, epidemic in America, and part of men's mental health is that they have a purpose, that they are committed to something bigger than themselves. That's what makes men tick, is that they're doing good, that they're committed to something larger than themselves. And so, yes, you are 150% correct. Yes, men need something that they can commit to and be invested in. The other thing that militia provides that helps with men's mental health is it makes men more competent, because we offer training in everything you can imagine, anything you can think of that is masculine. We offer training in those realms, and it makes men more competent. And when men are more competent, they are also more confident. And competent men, they're sober-minded and self-controlled. When men lack competence, they lack confidence. And when they lack confidence, they become emotionally unstable. And so the men that you see lashing out in a violent fashion, whether it's mass shooters or, anything like that, those are typically men that are insecure or unsecure, however you want to say that. And it's because they lack competence and they lack confidence. And so, yes, the militia is excellent for men's health and well-being, for combating depression and making those men more sober-minded and more self-controlled, because they are constantly gaining skill sets, and it's allowing them to fit into their proper role in society. Because men have in my opinion, it's not my opinion, it's God's opinion, men have a biblical responsibility to protect the weak and the innocent within their sphere of influence, which obviously certainly extends to their families. A lot of times we extend it to our churches, but it goes beyond that. It's not just our churches and our families, it's our communities and our societies. And it's our job as men to protect them. It's a moral obligation to protect the weak and the innocent. And I would extend that sphere of influence not just to my community, but to anywhere that I'm geographically located. I think it's of paramount importance that men have the skill sets and the tools at their disposal that they can actually protect the weak and the innocent. And yeah, we build those skill sets into men. We're teaching them and training them, how to save lives, how to do CPR and basic first aid, and stop the bleed, and how to assist emergency medical personnel, how to clear roads. I mean, I just had 20 guys come back from North Carolina that have been down there for almost a week. Actually, were they? No, yeah, they were almost a week down there, because that's what Christian men in America do. Is when there are people in need, they show up. That's part of what makes us American. It's part of what makes Christian men. And in order to do that, you can't just show up and be like, well, I'm here, but I don't know anything. Somebody tell me what to do. You have to show up with competence. You have to show up with skill sets that make you a value to the people around you. And so, Absolutely. Yeah, you and whoever it was that said that, 150% correct. I love that.
Yeah. Well said, Dan. Thank you for saying that and addressing that. All right. Let's talk about the purpose of militia in today's society. Where do you see its place?
Sure. So I think in order to understand the place or the role of militia in today's society, we need to understand government in America. So I would say that, and I touched on that a little bit, that we're trying to overcome 100 years of indoctrination to help men understand their responsibility to well-regulated militia. I absolutely believe that. You know, we like to say that we have public schools. I may step on toes here, but well, we like to say that we have public schools in America. I think a more accurate statement would be that we have government indoctrination centers. And I believe that the bulk of those government indoctrination centers deliberately miseducate. Not necessarily that everyone who is involved with the education system does that deliberately, but when you have a federal Department of Education that is handing down mandates, they're going to exist. They are going to protect their power base. The Department of Education at the federal level was created to protect the federal government through indoctrination. That's its purpose. And so it deliberately miseducates people so that they don't understand. And I would consider there to be, we're stuck on this theme of threes, I guess. I think that there are three ways in particular that they deliberately miseducate people. And it's in the realm of civics. One is they miseducate people so that people don't know what form of government we have in America. Two is that they don't know what the purpose of government in America is. And three is that they don't know how that form of government is designed to work or function. If you poll people on the street, you ask them what form of government do we have in America, I would say 999 out of 1,000 are going to tell you that this is a democracy. You see it all over every major news network, defending democracy, protecting democracy, spreading democracy, on and on and on and on. This is not a democracy. This is a constitutional republic. They are fundamentally different. They don't exist for the same purpose. If we operate under the assumption that this is a democracy, and let's just be clear, it is operating more like a democracy and less like a constitutional republic. And you'll understand what I mean by that in just a minute. If we accept that this is operating as a democracy, well, what is the purpose of a democracy? The purpose of a democracy, a lot of people will say it's mob rule. Yeah, that's pretty close, honestly. The purpose of a democracy is to protect the individual liberty of the majority, the 51%. Whereas constitutional republic exists to protect the individual liberty of the minority, even if that's only one person out of 360 million. It's government's job to step in and protect their individual liberty. And if we want to know exactly what is the purpose of government in America, we actually have a document that tells us verbatim, for this reason, governments are instituted amongst men. And no one seems to know what that document is. Lots of times people will guess and they'll go, oh yeah, that's the Constitution. It's actually not the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is what tells us the purpose of government. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's in the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. When a government becomes destructive to these ends, it becomes the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, setting its foundation on such principles as to them would seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's the purpose of government in America, is that it would protect life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, it's interesting. I do lectures and seminars on this pretty regularly, and whenever I have an audience that I can interact with, I finish that and I say, now I would like to know, I want to do a quick poll here, and it's going to be multiple choice. What do you consider to be the greatest threat to your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in America today? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it radical terrorism? Or is it your own government?
Your own government.
And I get the same resounding response every time. Not a single dissenting voice saying that it's a foreign power or insurgency or anything like that. It's always their own government, which boggles my mind. How far have we strayed or fallen, however you want to look at that, that the organization that we instituted, that we bought and paid for in blood to protect life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, poses the greatest threat to it. What an awful shame that's the condition of America. And so if we understand what form of government we have, and we understand what the purpose of that form of government is, we then have to understand how that form of government is designed to work, or how it's designed to function. And I think the first thing that we need to wrap our mind around is that this constitutional republic was built around the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. And the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, in a nutshell, is that power would reside at the lowest level, where it's most easily accessed by and most easily influenced by the people. Which, if you look at the Second Amendment doesn't say a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a nation. It doesn't say necessary to the security of the federal government. It says necessary to the security of a free state, which at the time was the lesser magistrate. And let me just give you a little bit of perspective. Do you have any idea how many voters there were in the state of Virginia when the U.S. Constitution was ratified?
I have no clue.
There were 78,000 voters.
What?
There were something like 490,000 residents, 78,000 registered voters. For perspective, Campbell County has 55,000 residents. A bunch of the counties like Fauquier and Prince William and some of those counties that are outside of D.C., they've got 500,000 people. So
sounds right, because traffic is really bad.
No doubt. I avoid it like the plague.
Yes.
But the lesser magistrates were the states. Now those lesser magistrates are really county and city localities. And so that doctrine of the lesser magistrate is very, very important, because it puts power, and I would argue that there are only two forces or powers on earth. We hear this idea all the time kicked around of power of the people. We usually attribute that to America. In America, we have this idea of power of the people, which is an accurate statement. We do. But when you ask people about that, it's a little ambiguous. It's a little hard for us to define. When you say, well, what does that mean? What is power of the people in America? Usually the response you get is, oh, well, it's voting. Well, is it though? Because they have elections in Russia, and they had elections in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was ruling. Somehow, 99.5% of the population voted for Saddam. I feel like that's unlikely. Same thing in Russia. Like, yeah, they have elections, but somehow everyone votes for the same guy. Is voting really, is it really power? And I would guess that a lot of your listeners, if we talked about the last presidential election, would dispute the idea of whether or not voting is power. And I would say that voting is not. It's essentially asking. And I would say that the majority of people in America asked for Donald Trump in the last election. We were told no. Whether or not that's accurate, honestly, I don't have any idea. But I will say that there was an awful lot of harm that was done to the faith that Americans have in the free and fair election process in America.
Absolutely.
And I don't know what can be done to restore that faith in that system at this point. Maybe it has been irreparably damaged. I don't know. But I would argue that voting is not a power, and it doesn't really matter whether you're conservative or you're liberal or whatever. Chances are likely that after this next presidential election, whoever is sitting in the Oval Office, a significant portion of the population is going to believe that that person is not there via a free and fair election. And yeah, going back to what I said a minute ago, I would argue that there are only two real forces or powers on Earth. One of those, of course, is violence. We see that acted out all over the world, and we have since the beginning of time with Cain and Abel. Everyone knows that violence is a real force or real power. And I would argue that there is only one other force or power on Earth, and I'm, of course, excluding the power of God, but that man has immediate or direct access to. And I would say that Teddy Roosevelt captured that principle perfectly when he said, "Walk softly, but carry a big stick." It's a threat of force or a threat of violence. And that's real power. That's what the American people are designed to wield. And that's what was intended by the Second Amendment. Because the Second Amendment doesn't say war or violence is necessary to the security of a free state. The Second Amendment says the existence of well-regulated militia is what's necessary. That the people at the lowest level would possess force of arms, that they would possess a passive threat of violence. That's what's intended by the Second Amendment, is that we, the people of these United States, would maintain that monopoly on force. So I very firmly believe that that's what was intended by the founders, that's our God-given right as men, as biblical men, as Americans, is that we would maintain force of arms, that we would maintain corporate defense. It's not just as simple as self-defense. The next step beyond self-defense is community or corporate defense, that we would be able to protect those around us from evil and violent men, because really no one can deny that those men exist. Yes. That it's a real thing. And it's our responsibility as biblical men in America to protect each other and the weak and the innocent from that.
So are there current restrictions put in place that affect militia groups in the individual states?
Not really. So a lot of people will try to cite paramilitary activities clauses, which I think at this point every state has one. I believe the federal government just passed a paramilitary activities clause as well, or the paramilitary activities law. All of those carry language that says, oh, well, you can't train to arms for the purpose of inciting violence or civil unrest, that you can't be trying to overthrow the government, that you can't be, doing all these nefarious things, which obviously organizations like mine are firmly invested in preserving and protecting the finest republic in the history of the world. We are extensively involved in the political process at every level, state, local, national, through Republican committees, the whole nine yards. You are not going to find people who are better educated on government or who are more invested and more involved in their government than my membership ultimately.
But in today's society, the problem is that it's all perception. So Congress met in 2023 to, quote, examine the role of militia groups in the current rise of right-wing extremism. Mm-hmm. And after that meeting, a bill was introduced to both the Senate and the House called Preventing Private Paramilitary Act of 2024. And the federal government would be given the authority to prosecute anyone involved with a militia. So that is still going through Congress right now. There's not much movement with it, but it's all, how are they perceiving extremism? I mean, and we're going to be talking about your story. I mean, all you have to do is say, though, this person, just put it in an article, this person is a right-wing extremist, and you will be targeted.
Absolutely.
And your militia will be targeted.
Absolutely. And that's the problem with language like that, is it's unbelievably vague and ambiguous and open to
Yes.
interpretation. And I mean, ultimately, you or I can call anything we want extremist. What does that word mean?
Yeah.
And
who is defining that?
exactly, which is that's the fundamental problem with passing laws that have that kind of vague and ambiguous language. And yes, I'm fully aware that people who are lawyers will say, oh, well, it's, whatever a reasonable person would think. I would say that myself and a lot of people on the left probably have drastically different definitions of what reasonable is. So, that idea of whatever a reasonable person would think is really flawed to its core, because reasonable is extremely vague and ambiguous. So it's almost like we're using the word to define itself. It's like circular reasoning.
Yeah. So how do you get beyond that? If that is the basis of this bill, and then people are going to be prosecuted based on their definition and their perceived, I don't know, opinion of you. I mean, what do you make of this?
Well, in my opinion, that's by design. And the reason that's by design, the reason that they have moved in that direction, is because they know that this nation is full of people like me that are red, white, and blue-blooded Americans. And you will never hear anything illegal, immoral, or unethical come out of my mouth. So they can't do anything about me that way. They have to come up with another way that they can. And I mean, you saw that through the January 6th. We started out with, I think they started out with people who they claimed had vandalized, federal property. And then it was like, well, anyone who trespassed, anyone who came into the building, which they were invited into, we're going to go after them. And then it's, well, anyone who was on the Capitol grounds. And so they just keep changing or expanding the definition and basically making up excuses to come after people. And honestly, I don't think it's even that they necessarily consider any of the people that they're incarcerating to be a threat, but they are trying to make an example out of people so that there will be a widespread fear of incarceration.
For sure.
Which that's not America.
No, it's not.
That's not what we do in America. We don't incarcerate political dissidents because they believe differently than we believe. That's not what. There's a stupid quote from and I'm not sure who wrote it, but it's I think it's from the comic book Captain America, and I can't remember the whole thing, but I can't remember it verbatim, but the gist of it is that it doesn't matter what the press or the mobs or the government or the whole world, if they all decide that something wrong is something right. This nation was founded on one principle. Above all else, which is that we stand up for what we believe. And when the mobs and the press and the whole world decide that something wrong is something right, we plant ourselves like a tree next to the river of truth, and we tell the whole world, no, you move. And there is an awful lot of truth to that. That is the essence of Americans. Americans are men and women that will give up themselves for someone else. Not men and women that are going to try to silence someone else or incarcerate them because they think or believe differently, that they're going to consider everyone who voted for, a guy like Donald Trump to be a threat, that they're going to be fearful of them. That's not what Americans are. That's not who we are. That's not what we do. That's not how we act. But unfortunately, partially due to the media, we're making that acceptable. We're making that mainstream.
Dan, I'm really proud of you. You are well-spoken, and you've taken such an incredible stand. I mean, folks, this guy is incredible. Boy, we need him in every single county. No, we need in every single county men to stand up, just like Dan has. Well, and we need them to speak out.
And yeah, I'm being more vocal. I recognize that, I painted a huge target on my back when I started speaking out publicly and allowing myself to be recorded and putting it on the internet. And I knew that I was putting a big target on my back. But, if not me, who? If not now, when? If not us, who? If not now, when?
Yes.
We're not gaining liberty in America. We're losing liberty by the day. And, obviously I like the Declaration of Independence. I love the end of the Declaration of Independence. The very last line of the Declaration of Independence says, with a firm reliance on the protections of the divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors. And I wholeheartedly believe that America is not lost. I am not unique. I'm not even unusual. There are millions and millions of American men just like me that are in, exactly like you say, they're in every county, every city, every town, every locality in America. There are men that are wholeheartedly committed to this idea of America that we have. I think there's a couple of problems. A, they feel like they're alone. We have promoted on the right this idea for a very, very long time that, well, we're the silent majority. But what being the silent majority has resulted in is it's resulted in us feeling like we're alone. Like we're in the minority, that there aren't other men like us, that there aren't other men that think the way that we do. Yeah, we've got 2 or 3 close buddies that think like us, but there's not enough of us. I can't believe that that's true. I have to believe that America is still made up of the finest men in the world. And that those men are still, I listened to a seminar a number of years ago. This is a little bit of a tangent, sort of, but I think it's on topic, and I think it's very important. I listened to a seminar that was done a number of years ago by an organization called Liberty Seed Project. And I don't remember the name of the guy that was teaching the lecture or the seminar, but he was talking about Lexington and Concord, and the British column, as it was retrograding back to Boston after the fiasco at Concord. And the British column was being bird dogged by colonial militia. They were following them basically in the woodline on both sides. And there was one company that was in the road that was marching behind them, making sure that they kept moving. And the order of the day that had been issued by John Parker was, and you'll remember this as soon as I say it, it was stand your ground, do not fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it be here or let it be today. And so that is the order that they were operating under. There were 2 things that you needed to understand to really appreciate the story. And one of those is that violation of a militia commander's order was it was punishable by death. You faced a firing squad or a noose if you violated the order that was given to you. And the other thing that you need to understand is that these men didn't know each other. They came from a huge geographic area, and men did not travel the way they travel today. Honestly, they had too much to do to be doing traveling. And so these men didn't know each other. They came from a huge geographic area, and they understood that they could not violate that order. So what happened is the British column encountered a bridge that was too narrow for the whole column to pass. And so it kind of bottlenecked and stopped the whole column. And the company that was in the road didn't stop marching. They continued to march and get closer to the tail of the column. And the British decided, well, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to give these guys a volley and back them off. So they formed a firing line in the road. Now, one of the colonial officers is watching what's transpiring on the road in front of him. And he makes the determination, well, I know what's going to happen. And those men are going to get slaughtered in the road. I may not know them, it's a different company, but I can't just sit idly by and watch that happen because of the order that I was issued. And so recognizing that he's going to face a firing squad, he gives the order to load and make ready and open fire. And they do, and they cut down that rear guard detachment in the road, and there were no Americans that were killed there. And the guy teaching the seminar stops. He says, you hear all the time people talking about that lone shot at Lexington Green. No one knows where that shot came from. That's the shot heard around the world. That's the moment that America was born. And he said, I don't think that's true. He says, I believe that this is the moment that America was born. He said, the moment that a man decided that he would lay down his life for some other man that he doesn't even know, he said, that's what makes America America. He says, I want you to tell me what other nation in the history of the world has sent their young men by the hundreds of thousands to die and soak someone else's dirt in their blood to buy someone else's liberty. He said, it has never happened. There is no other nation in the history of the world that has paid for other people's liberty and blood, not to conquer other nations, not to build an empire, not to rule over them, but to literally purchase the liberty of other nations in blood. He said, America's unique. It is the only one. And I still believe that that is true. I have to believe that this country is full of men just like that, that will, if push comes to shove, that they will lay down their lives for someone else's liberty.
I know there are. And they're part of our group, Feds for Freedom. It's
right on.
A whole host of men and women who are doing that exact thing.
Right on.
All right, let's get to your story. So I saw military.com, the article written about you and your militia. And they were basically calling the Lynchburg, Campbell County Militia extremist. And repeatedly throughout the article, they drew a connection between the rise of militia and the increasing diversity amongst the area's population. They were drawing a race connection right here.
Sure.
And then they started talking. I mean, you could hardly call this an article. It was a hit piece.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is.
I'll include the link below for everyone to see. What do you make of this article, and what happened as a result?
Well, yeah.
And I have a question. Why you? Why this militia?
Well, that's a good question. I have a theory that I'm not necessarily prepared to divulge at the moment, but I have a theory. Let me just say this: it is very, very clearly a targeted hit piece. So I would say that there is someone involved there that has it out for me and my wife personally. I'm just going to leave it at that. But I also think that there is an element here where when you represent what Campbell County Militia represents, like I said, we knew we were painting a bullseye on our backs when we moved down the road of being an overtly public organization that was going to seek government recognition, that was going to be involved with the political process. We knew we were painting a big target. Constitutional or well-regulated militia, it's not a secret society. This is not something that can exist hiding in the shadows. That's never what was intended when they wrote that this was necessary to security of a free state. I believe that at least pursuing a relationship with local and state government should be a requirement. And we knew that when we moved down the road of we're going to put real power in the hands of the American people, that they were coming for us. There are people in America, in government, that are absolutely committed to maintaining that monopoly on force. They're absolutely committed to exerting power and having the ability to compel people to do whatever they're told without question. And they're never going to tolerate this idea of power moving back into the hands of the American people where it belongs. They'll never put up with that. So, yeah, we knew that there was going to be a huge bullseye. The gentleman that was the commander of CCM before myself, Wes Gardner, he got fired from an excellent job because of his involvement with militia.
Wow.
We understand that there's a price to be paid. But again, if not us, who? If not now, when?
So the article brought up the National Guard and said that the National Guard commander in your area was known, or of the state of Virginia was known for not recognizing or going after extremist personnel, something to that line of thought. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
But then he said the man who wrote the article was calling you extremist and basically calling on them to do an investigation on you. At the time of the article, there was no investigation on you, and then one was opened.
Yes.
So how far after the article was written was that opened?
It was opened when he started harassing the Army National Guard and submitting FOIA requests and creating a media circus about it. Because, then the Guard, they have to do something. Although what they could have said is, yes, he's already been investigated by the Department of Defense and by the U.S. Pentagon, and yeah, they don't have any issue with it. So too bad.
Wait, so had an investigation been opened on you before?
Correct. Yeah, way back in, I guess it would have been the beginning of 21. There was an investigation that was conducted by the Pentagon. And yeah, the Pentagon said no issue.
And that was brought up just because you were the commander of this militia?
Back in 21?
Yes.
Yeah, I think at the time I was the executive officer. Yeah, again, we were overtly public, and someone to do with the aftermath of the January 6th thing said, hey, this dude's involved with the militia. The Pentagon looked into it and went, yeah, well, there's no issue with this militia. These guys are upstanding citizens. And yeah, so yeah, I've already been investigated and cleared once. Now they just want to play double jeopardy, I guess.
You are right in the middle of something happening right now to get rid of militia in this country. I mean, we see it by this bill coming through Congress right now. We also see it through this. There's a DOD directive that was just signed by the Deputy Secretary of Defense in September 27th, 2024. And the new provisions in this directive updated the circumstances under which the DOD can assist law enforcement, including the use of lethal force, which was very interesting. There, and I'll include the link so everyone could go look at it up. But basically, it's kind of how do I say it? It is getting the Department of Defense, the military, to support law enforcement to use lethal force against people they see as extremist. And they say in here, it expanded the definition of national security threats and raising alarms. And this is particularly given the Department of Homeland Security's broader definition of domestic terrorism threats, which we're both on the list for domestic terrorism because we're Christians and we've pushed back in some way. So it's like the military is potentially going to be using lethal force with law enforcement against people known for their extremist thoughts. You've already been labeled an extremist. I mean, then they're getting rid of the militia as well. What do you make of all this?
I mean, I don't know that I really need to speculate on that. I think it's to me it's pretty cut and dry. Is law enforcement lacking the manpower to do their job, that they have to use Title 10 soldiers to do their job? Are we fighting a war in America that I didn't know about, possibly?
And so they could say, well, fewer and fewer people are joining the police force, so why not use the military? And we know that's a fact. Fewer people are joining the police force.
Well, yes, that's accurate. It's a direct violation of federal law to use Title 10 soldiers on you. there are supposed to be advantages to being an American. One of those advantages is that your own government's not going to wage war on you because they feel like it. So yeah, there's supposed to be advantages to citizenship. Apparently, we're just going to kind of whittle away at some of those advantages. But I just don't see what. And it's interesting because so. If you look at, the Second Amendment says that well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, but it doesn't tell us why. It doesn't tell us what the use or the purpose of well-regulated militia is. However, the Constitution does tell us, because if we look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the U.S. Constitution, it says that Congress shall call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, repel invasion, and suppress insurrection. So it's interesting to me that, because what it sounds like is, oh, well, we want to be able to use federal troops or Title X troops to enforce law, suppress insurrection, or repel invasion. But you have the manpower at your disposal through militia.
That's right.
But for some reason, you don't want to use the American people. Why is that? Why is it that you don't have faith that the American people will be willing to fulfill their responsibility to enforce the law?
You mean private citizens?
Well, I mean, private citizens are unorganized militia, right?
Mm-hmm,
that is well-regulated or constitutional militia, which is interesting because I'm going to, just real quick, I'm going to touch on so if you want to get a good idea of where the founders stood on militia and the purpose of militia, which you touched on at the beginning of our conversation, was about resisting tyranny. Madison, who was a Federalist and was in favor of maintaining a standing army, authored Federalist Papers 45 and 46. And in Federalist Papers 45 and 46, he talks about the fact that he doesn't consider a standing army to be a threat because of well-regulated militia. He said a standing army is no threat if well-regulated militia is maintained. And he actually says that the militia should be maintained at a status that is 20 times greater than whatever the number of the standing army is, so that there is no possibility of federal troops abusing the people.
We've gotten.
And so it's very interesting seeing things from the perspective of the men that wrote the document. It kind of completely debunks this whole idea that, oh, it's about self-defense or it's about hunting or something like that. That was never the intent of the Second Amendment. And the men who were in favor of a standing army, the Federalists, made that argument. Hamilton said that we didn't have anything to... There were people that were opposed to the maintenance of militia. They just wanted a standing army. And he said, what are you afraid of? He said, are you somehow concerned that the whole body of the people, if they maintain force of arms, is going to execute violence against or oppress the whole body of the people? He says, that's nonsense. He said, if we fear that, we should also fear hydras and medusas, because mythical monsters are an equal threat to the whole body of the people, somehow oppressing the whole body of the people. He said, that's nonsense. So yeah, if you look at this stuff in historical context, there is no other conclusion that you can possibly come to than that force of arms should reside in the hands of the American people. But apparently there are people that fear the idea of the American people possessing force of arms.
Absolutely.
Boggles my mind why that would be.
Yeah, I have absolutely no doubt that the article that came out about you, your situation, the bill in Congress, the DOD Directive, what the Secretary of the Army is saying, which I will read here coming up, that is happening right now. There's no coincidence in it, and it's right before an election. There is a reason. So, this episode is to bring awareness to this situation and what's going on with you. So the Secretary of the Army said, and it was quoted in this article, active participation in extremist activities can be prohibited even in some circumstances in which such activities would be constitutionally protected in a civilian setting. So they're saying people involved in extremist activities, which we haven't defined and it's up to the person, I guess, enforcing the policy to define. Those people involved with that will be prohibited. The participation with extremist activities can be prohibited. I can't speak. Prohibited, even in when it would be protected in a civilian setting, like in everyday life, if you're not part of a militia.
One of my gripes with America or with Americans is that we have allowed ourselves to be manipulated into division. We allow ourselves to be divided based on gender. We allow ourselves to be divided based on color. We allow ourselves to be divided based on religion or any number of other things that you can imagine. We allow ourselves to be manipulated and wedges to be driven in there. And I look at that as an attempt to drive a wedge between the American people and the American military, which the intent in America is always that we would have citizen soldiers. And they're clearly trying to drive a wedge between the citizenry and the soldiery, which is not what was ever intended in America. The intent in America was always that we have citizen soldiers. That's one of the beautiful things about the National Guard is you have citizen soldiers. So yeah, there is a very, very clear, in my opinion, mission there to drive that wedge and say, no, you're not going to be both. You're not going to be involved with citizen organizations and with soldier organizations.
Yeah. Well, this is absolutely, it's mind-boggling how we've gotten to this place. How have your fellow National Guardsmen responded to all of this?
The support that I have received from the Guard has been absolutely overwhelming. I'll be honest with you, I have not encountered any negative feedback whatsoever from any corner of the Guard at all, not even through the grapevine. Every soldier that I interact with, and some of them, I'll be honest with you, I don't even know who they are, but they know who I am and come up to me and, hey, or, just wanted to let you know, I think what they're doing is really, really dirty. I was really sorry to hear that. I just judge people based on what I know of them and everything that I know of them. You've always been a great soldier. And, and of course, everyone that knows me is just absolutely appalled that they would, try to call into question my patriotism or that, there would be really anything going on. Anyone that knows me at all is fully aware of how deep my patriotism runs and how committed I am to preserving and protecting the finest republic that has ever existed in the history of the world. And so the support that the entire military community has shown me has just been absolutely overwhelming. Both from all the people that I knew on active duty. I have received dozens and dozens and dozens of messages from soldiers that I have had zero interaction with since I left active duty, just saying, hey, man, just wanted to let you know I'm here if you need anything, on your side. The same thing within the Guard. The amount of support that I have received from those soldiers currently wearing the uniform that I serve with or that I have served with in the Guard has been absolutely overwhelming. And I'm telling you what, it feels really, really good to know that those people support me and stand with me and trust me.
Yes. Well, and that's why you've been censored. So I reached out to Dan over Facebook. We were talking, and then suddenly his profile disappears. So Facebook has gotten you.
Correct.
Took down your.
Now, for anyone that followed my social media before it disappeared, I never post anything that could even begin to be in violation of their community standards. Not even close. Honestly, I hardly ever post anything. And I don't post anything that even begins to flirt with their community standards. But they removed my Facebook, they removed my Instagram, they removed my wife Alex's Facebook and her Instagram. She doesn't post anything other than an occasional historical article or something like that. And I post almost nothing. So the idea that we're in violation of community standards is an absolute joke. It is clearly a move to silence my voice, because they don't want people to be able to follow the story. They don't want people to be able to show support for me. And so they will do everything in their power to stop that.
Yes.
They want people to just forget and just that I'll go quietly into the night, but there is no chance.
No. Well, any last thoughts before I ask my last question?
I don't think so.
So, if the average American citizen could do one thing to combat the corruption that we see today, what would it be?
We need force of arms, which means well-regulated militia, that passive threat in every community in America. If you do not have a well-regulated constitutional militia in your community, you need to reach out to me. We have a roadmap. We've done it. Neighboring counties have done it. This is going to spread like wildfire because Americans need hope.
Yes.
You know, that's why Donald Trump has been so unbelievably popular, is because he represents, or people place their hope in him. And the problem is that hope it's misplaced hope. Not because Trump is a bad guy or he's not going to do what he says he's going to do or anything like that. That has nothing to do with it. It's misplaced because this is a constitutional republic. It was never built in such a way that it could be saved by one man or even a group of men. And by a group of men, I mean 51 senators, 218 congressmen, or 5 out of 9 justices. This is a government that's commissioned by we, the people of these United States. The only ones who can preserve and protect this are we, the people of these United States. The hope for America is that we put real power back in the hands of the American people where it belongs, at the lowest level where it can be easily accessed and easily influenced by the people.
That's well said. Dan, thank you. It's such a pleasure to finally meet you over the internet, but thank you for everything that you're doing to stand strong.
Oh, it's an absolute joy. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share our podcasts. Visit our website where you can sign up for our latest newsletters and become a member of Feds for Freedom at fedsforfreedom.org.